Hello there, my name is Jenna Van Mourik, and I'm here to do the video interview for Alan Stedham's YouTube channel. I'm so excited to be here, so let's get into the questions.
Can you sum up who you are in one sentence?
For me, this is really hard, and I think this is a really hard question for most writers because we're obsessed with words and it's very hard to summarize ourselves and summarize our books. But moving on from that, what I usually tell people is that I am an inspired writer and an inspirational fiction reader, which is the short answer. The longer answer is that I am a 21-year-old college student majoring in English at California Baptist University, living in Northern California, who writes biblical fiction novels and loves to share the love of the biblical fiction and Christian fiction genre all the time across the internet, across all the platforms. So I hope that that made sense. Luckily, if it didn't, we've got a lot more interview questions to help you guys get to know me.
What led you to become a Christian?
I have to say that that's not really a dramatic story for me, and I think this is the story of a lot of people who are raised in Christian homes, so it's nothing new or necessarily exciting, but I come from a long line of pastors and PKs and pastors' kids, so church has kind of just always been a thing for me, and you might even go so far as to say that I felt like the church was my second home, my home away from home. It was like a part of my domain and my territory, so to speak. So I didn't really have necessarily a coming to Christ moment. I do have a few memories though, and one of my earliest memories is with my family going to church, and another one would be with my grandma. My grandparents were very faithful people. My grandpa is still here, but my grandma has sadly gone to be with the Lord, which is great for her, not as fun for us here on earth, but we'll see her again soon. And they used to get up really early, grandpa still does, in the morning to read their Bibles and to pray for the whole family. I remember when I was little, before I could read, grabbing my children's Bible, which looks like this, and sitting down next to my grandma to study with her and just imitate her because I saw her doing it, so I thought it was cool. And I would sit down with her and pretend to read even though I couldn't read the words myself. And this will come into play more later, but throughout my life, when I was about 3 or 4 years old, I was in Sunday school and they were having a lesson on becoming a Christian. And I remember hearing this, and this person, this children's pastor, explaining it to all of us youths, essentially said, when you become a Christian, there's a big party in heaven. And then eventually, when you pass away, you'll get to go to heaven and live in a very great big house with Jesus. And it'll be really fun for you. And I thought to myself, well, I really want a great big house and I really want Jesus to live in my heart, so I'm going to become a Christian. So I prayed the little prayer that they gave us on little worksheets and became a Christian officially. And then I went home and I told my parents, guys, I have a really exciting announcement. I'm a homeowner now. I have a massive mansion. It's full of toys. It's gonna be great. There's a big party going on. We're not invited to it, but there's a party happening right now because Jesus lives in my heart now. And I remember my parents saying, well, that's great because Jesus is in our hearts too. So now we all have him in our hearts. And I was very upset by that. And I said, that's not fair. Jesus can only be in my heart. That's not fair, and it doesn't make sense. It's very illogical. But I learned eventually that Jesus can be in all of our hearts. So that's my funny little anecdote on how I became a Christian. But of course, later in life, my faith changed and developed as I went through Christian school and Christian college, and even to this day, still growing and developing as a Christian.
What inspired you to become an author?
What inspired me to become an author is actually a bit of a long story, and if you don't know, I'm a writer who writes currently biblical fiction and is pursuing publication with my biblical fiction novel, which I'll explain more about biblical fiction and all of that later. But in terms of what inspired me to become an author, I always was a very creative child. I was also an only child, but I had lots of cousins. And for me, that meant that I was the boss. And I used to write plays all the time and enlist them to perform in these plays with me. And I used to just read all the time and tell stories and write scripts and make movies on my laptop webcam all the time. That was my thing. I actually initially started my college career as a film student, a film major. I quickly learned in my film classes that my passion wasn't in that industry. I love film. I love studying film. I love studying old movies. And if you get me started, I can go on a very, very, very long rant about Citizen Kane and symbolism in Citizen Kane, but I will spare you that for now. But I knew that I still wanted to do something creative, and when I left film, writing became something I did as a hobby while I tried to figure out what I did want to study in college. And after a few general ed classes and me going back and forth with these various fiction writing projects that I did as a hobby, I kind of realized, wait a second, why am I not just majoring in writing? Because I'm doing this anyways, and I really, really like it, and I love reading and I love books. So that's kind of how I became an author and a writer, because I have always known that I'm a very creative person and I wanted to do something creative. And when I got to college, writing seemed like a great option for me because it has a lot of flexibility when you're a writer. Post-college education, you can write books, you can be an editor, you can work for companies as a copywriter, and there's all kinds of job opportunities when you major in English and major in writing. So it seemed like a solid option to present to my parents when I was like, I'm changing my major. And it was still creative enough that it fulfilled this creative need that I have always had from the time that I was very young until the present.
Why are you so passionate about biblical fiction?
Why I'm passionate about biblical fiction really kind of goes all the way back to my childhood, and I have some props with me to explain this because this is a large part of my testimony, and I've kind of been going a little bit short on all the answers leading up to this because I knew that this was going to be the question that took up the bulk of my interview time. To get started, when I was very, very young, I had, again, this Bible, which is the Bible in pictures for little eyes. And it's not necessarily a Bible, but it is all the stories and with pictures that kids can read and understand. And as you can tell, I very much loved this to pieces. This was actually a gift from my grandma and grandpa that I mentioned before. They have a little note in here, but it's very much falling apart. But I remember just obsessing over these illustrations when I was a kid. I could stare at them for an extremely long period of time. I want to show you guys my favorite one because it's very important. This was actually my favorite picture in the whole book that I used to love looking at. This is Miriam watching baby Moses in the river, in the Nile River. And this is, of course, the Pharaoh's daughter retrieving him. And then we get to Exodus and then back to Pharaoh with the plagues and the blood over the door of the people, the Passover, and then the cloud and the fire, and then crossing the Red Sea. And these were my favorite pictures to look at. I loved how bright and vivid they were. And I just really loved hearing Bible stories when I was a kid. In fact, as I've said before, I was very obsessed with movies and film and theater and all of that kind of thing growing up. I loved performing arts and I loved watching films and analyzing them, which is how I got into film. But I had movies that I would watch over and over and over again. I now have them all on DVD copy because I'm pretty sure I destroyed our old VHS tapes, if you even know what that means, VHS from back in the day. But my all-time favorite movie of all time, and to a certain extent it still is my favorite movie, was The Prince of Egypt, the musical by DreamWorks. I used to watch this all the time, and then I also loved The Miracle Maker, which is a stop-motion animation film. So both of these are animated kind of kid adaptations of Bible stories. This is a story of like the Passion and the Christ and his ministry, and then this is, of course, the Prince of Egypt, the Exodus. And then I also really loved this little animated series, The Greatest Adventure Stories from the Bible, and this one is a Noah's Ark episode. There used to be a lot more of these, but I don't think they ever re-released them all on DVD. They died with VHS, very sadly, but I do have this one still and these, and I would watch these over and over and over again, and I was just obsessed with them. I loved the colors, the stories. It was all incredibly vibrant for me, and I really really was just very passionate about it, and I could watch them over and over again and never get tired of them, and to a certain extent that is still very true. As a kid, if I wasn't watching TV, I was also a very auditory learner. I loved listening to things, whether that was music or audio programs or audiobooks, and I do still have some of my favorites from my childhood here. I had a few. Like I said, I was very much obsessed with the Exodus and the story of Moses coming out of Egypt, but I have a few Prince of Egypt CDs here that I just would love. You can see the cases are cracked and torn apart, but I loved them very dearly. Something else that I used to listen to when I was a child were these teddy bear bedtime Bible stories. If you don't know what these are a collection of CDs of the Bible stories told by a teddy bear. He reads them to you and asks little discussion questions at the end. They were very fun for me as a kid. And then my absolute favorite would be the Adventures in Odyssey audio tapes. These are like audio stories, radio dramas, and I especially loved the ones where they would do Bible stories like Jesus awakening from the tomb or crossing the Red Sea, or this one is the Christmas story, the Nativity. And I loved these. I would listen to them over and over and over again. And if I pulled them out, you'd see how scratched and torn apart the CDs are. But I loved them. I do still love them all. I keep them all, obviously, because they had such a huge impact on my life. But when I was a kid, I really didn't understand why I enjoyed Bible stories so much. I just knew that I did, and I loved watching various adaptations, and when I got into high school, the Bible miniseries came out, and I watched that a ton, and it just truly fascinated me and captured my mind, but I never really understood why that was or why I was so invested in biblical stories or adaptations of them, and it especially didn't make sense to me when I was trying to choose a career. When I got older, I got this Bible, which is a study Bible, and this was my Bible for my high school years, and I think maybe even junior high years, but I loved this one because of all the notes that were inside, the pictures, the maps, and the way it took you into the mindset of the biblical figures, and I poured constant hours over this Bible, reading it and looking at the pictures and learning like character studies of why certain biblical figures would have thought the way they did or acted the way they did. And again, I never knew why this was. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I just knew that it was a thing that I very much was enthralled with. I can't stress that enough, of how big of an impact these stories and things made on my life. But they clearly did make a big impact on my life. And I was just very fascinated by biblical culture. I loved studying that culture. My father was in the Navy for the majority of my youth. He retired when I was in high school, but he used to go on a lot of trips overseas to the Middle East, and I loved when he would come back because he would always bring me little trinkets or things that I still keep with me today, of just artwork or souvenirs from the Middle East that I loved, and I would keep them and display them, and I love them. And I just always knew that these kinds of things were very important to me, but again, I didn't understand why. I just knew that I was obsessed with them, and I kind of thought it was like any other obsession that you might have, like with Star Wars or other movie series or bands or things that you think that are cool when you're a kid. But I loved learning about the culture, and I had an extensive knowledge about it as well. I remember a specific memory of when I was 10 years old watching the Indiana Jones movies with a friend, and one of them asked me a question. They asked a question about why the Ark of the Covenant was so important in the first film, and I remember being about like 10 or 11, maybe 12 or 13 years old at the time, and just going on a whole rant about the history of the Ark of the Covenant and its cultural significance, things that probably most normal 10-year-olds wouldn't have such an extensive knowledge of, but I did. So I was that kid. I was a weird history nerd / history major. Another thing that made a big impact on my life was drive-through history documentaries. My grandma, who I've mentioned a lot throughout this video, had the collection of drive-through history documentaries, and now I have them, but these, if you've never heard of these, they're essentially little documentaries. They're kind of funny. They're not necessarily serious documentaries, but they're by Dave Stotts, and they're kind of meant for kids and middle graders and that kind of younger audience to introduce them to biblical locations and the kind of idea is that he rents a car and then he just drives through the Holy Land, or he drives through Rome, and as he gets to different locations, he stops and explains the biblical history or the cultural significance. And I remember going to her house and visiting her and just being so excited to pull out another Drive Through History DVD and start a new episode, and I adored them, and they were kind of my first entry into research, you might say. I didn't know it at the time, but now I think it was preparing early on to write biblical fiction, and you can see my grandma's names are still written on all the tops of the DVDs. But that's just another example of me being obsessed with biblical history and culture and Bible stories when I was very young. But specifically, how did I discover biblical fiction and how I became so passionate about it happened actually right after my grandmother passed away. That was very traumatic for me because, as I'm sure you've been able to tell throughout this video, she's been a huge part of my faith journey and a huge part of how I developed a love for Bible stories. I learned from watching her study how to study the Bible, and from watching her DVDs, she really helped plant and solidify that love for biblical history and just interpretations of Bible stories and teaching them herself. She was a teacher for a large part of her life, and so her loss was very difficult for me. And I remember I have always loved reading, but at that point I kind of had a falling out with all arts. I didn't enjoy reading or watching movies, and I kind of fell into a bit of a depression, a depressed slump. And I remember going to the local Barnes & Noble, and I never went to the Christian fiction section in Barnes & Noble because I kind of had this preconceived notion that a lot of Christian fiction could be a little bit not serious, not necessarily just not having the depth that I was looking for, because I loved depth in storytelling, and I think the general common conception of Christian fiction at the time was that it's a lot of surface level faith, maybe not a lot of great storytelling, predictability, preachiness even, and I wasn't interested in that. But I remember walking over there anyways because I was at that point just like, I'll try anything if it can distract me from the pain that I was feeling from her loss. And I wandered over there, and they had a very specific book. And I would not have picked up this book if it hadn't had this on the cover. I would not have purchased anything from that section because I'm sure, as you can tell, throughout my life, the Prince of Egypt, the story of Exodus, studying Egypt as a kid, I loved Egyptian history and Egyptian culture. It was so much a part of me. I have so many verses from that story, the Exodus, memorized. It's very much intertwined with me, and I remember seeing this book on the shelf, and this is The Pharaoh's Daughter by Misu Andrews, and I remember instantly just feeling drawn to it, like I needed to own it. And it is about the Exodus, about Moses' mother, about the Pharaoh's daughter who drew him from the Nile and raised him, and the story from her perspective, essentially. And one of the major themes of this book is also grief and fear. And I didn't know that at the time. I immediately just had to purchase it because it had Egypt on the cover. And I purchased it and I read it. I'd never heard of biblical fiction. I'd never heard of Misu Andrews, but I knew I had to own this book because it had Exodus on the cover, on the back, everywhere. And I purchased it, and it completely changed my life. I fully credit this book and a few others for pulling me out of my grief and giving me hope during that time, and also for bringing Bible stories to life in a new way, because when my grandmother passed away, I was around 16 or 17 years old. I didn't really enjoy my Sunday school lessons anymore, or children's videos as much as I had. But this brought them to life again for me in a way that I could start seeing things new in them as a young adult and as an adult, and I could learn new things from them. And I love biblical fiction as a form of Bible study because it really draws me into the Bible stories, and then it encourages me and makes me want to go back into my Bible and read the biblical account because I notice new things or I gain new perspectives from the books that I might not have otherwise gotten. It's the same thing as like listening to a sermon or listening to a Bible study on a Bible story. It's inspiring, and it draws me back to the real Bible, to the real biblical account. And after And after I purchased this book, I very quickly went out in search of every other biblical fiction book because I read this in about 24 hours. I finished it in a day. And I returned to Barnes & Noble the following week because I needed more books. I couldn't just stop there. The only other biblical fiction book that they had on their shelves at the time was The Crimson Cord by Jill Eileen Smith, which I purchased, obviously. And I read it in a day, and I just started to eat up these books. I could read them in 2 to 3 hours flat. If I was just sitting down and focused on them, I could just blow through them, and they just captivated me in a way that I hadn't known since Adventures in Odyssey, or since The Prince of Egypt, or since the Teddy Bear Bedtime Bible Story CDs. So after that, I very quickly went on to Amazon and added every other Misu Andrews and Jill Eileen Smith book into my cart and began ordering them and devouring them in just as fast a pace. And then the next book that I discovered was Counted with the Stars by Connie Lynn Cassette, which I had to buy again because it was an Exodus story, and it just drew me into that time period that I loved, and I've always seen so much of myself in Moses. My life verse, or my favorite Bible passage, actually comes from the account of the burning bush when Moses is telling God, "Why me?" And he's kind of objecting to God's plan because he's afraid, and I've always struggled with fear and anxiety. And God says to Moses, "Who made man's mouth? Who made the deaf, the mute, the seeing, or the blind? Did not I? Now go, and I will teach you what to say." So that has always been something that I very much identified with, and when I started to discover these books that not only covered subject matter like that I had already loved as a child, but did it in a way that brought depth, it completely changed my perception of Christian fiction, and I was opened up to this whole world of biblical fiction. It has since become my mission to purchase every single biblical fiction book ever written, because I love them so much, and I'm very passionate about it because I think that it can give us new perspective about the Bible, and I think that good biblical fiction will point us back to the Bible. It won't take away from the Bible, it won't add to the Bible, it won't make us feel uncomfortable like we're reading something that we shouldn't be reading. Good biblical fiction should point us back to His Word and back to His truth so that we can return to the biblical account and discover new things from it and gain new inspiration, new wisdom in ways that we might not have before if our eyes or hearts hadn't been opened first by the story. I'm also passionate about biblical fiction because I believe that Jesus taught us in parables, and I learn best through story, and I learn best about Bible stories through biblical fiction and through the discussion questions and the research that goes into them. So that's a little bit about how I got interested in biblical fiction and why I'm so passionate about biblical fiction. And as I said before, when I was in college and I didn't know what I wanted to do, once I discovered biblical fiction and writing, suddenly it became so clear to me that it felt like my whole life had been building to this moment. My obsessions that I just thought were crazy and childlike things in biblical adaptations suddenly made sense because I felt like I was meant to write adaptations like that. My love for documentaries like Drive Through History and others that I am not thinking of right now were precursors to the kind of research that I would be doing when I started writing my own novels. My love of study Bibles and my collection of study Bibles that I have was, to me, I realized that I'd been preparing my whole life to write biblical fiction and to share about biblical fiction. And once I realized that, I suddenly had direction and purpose. So again, I answered the last few questions in a short form because I felt like this question would be the best answer to culminate why I'm passionate about biblical fiction, why I write biblical fiction, what led me to become a Christian, what has strengthened my faith journey, my spiritual journey, and what has inspired me to write biblical fiction. I think it's all kind of encompassed in this one question, and it has become my life story in and of itself. So, yeah.
Can you tell us about your work in progress?
I think this next question, can you tell us about your WIP, is the bane of every author's existence, because it seems like Every time someone asks us to summarize our books, we draw a blank and we're like, I don't know, why don't you read it? But essentially, my WIP is, of course, naturally a biblical fiction novel that takes place during the time of Christ. The main character in this novel is a young girl, and her name is Shamira, and she is not based on me, but she was very much inspired by me in the book. She's 16 to 17, and I started writing this book when I was about 17, 18, started working on it as a way to express how I was feeling and the things I was going through at that time, with just questioning my plan, God's plan for my life, and questioning my grandmother's death and all of that kinds of things. And getting married. I got married when I was 18 years old. And I'm very happy that I did. I'm very happily married. But at the time, society would tell me things that I shouldn't be getting married that young. And I was questioning a lot of things. So I just started writing this book as a way to explore all of those different things. And it's very much, there's a lot of inspiration taken from things I've been through. And my family, a very big aspect of this book is family. I'm very close to my family. My family is everything to me, so it makes sense that that would be a major theme in my book. But in this book, Shamira, it takes place during Christ's ministry on earth. And Shamira's family is not necessarily a wealthy family. They are not important by any means in society's standards, and they struggle a lot throughout the book. Shamira's family are poor, they are shepherds, they don't have much, they have a lot of things that make society look down on them and question them. But Shamira has never questioned her family. The way that they choose to live their lives has just always been what it is to her. They are believers in God, and they are shepherds, and they're very humble, and that's a part of her identity. However, as she grows up, she starts to notice, as she comes of age, the way that society treats them differently for various reasons that include their lack of money, their financial status, their social status, they have family members with disabilities, and people kind of ask them things like, well, what sin did you all commit to deserve the position you're in? And Shamira has this question when people ask her that of, well, why do you think it's because of a sin that we committed? She doesn't understand, because for her, that's just the way it is. And she's never really felt like it's anything to be ashamed of. It's just their family. It's just their life. But as she gets older and her eyes are open to things that go on around her, for instance, the fact that she's a woman automatically places her in this position where people look down on her and don't value her opinion. But she realizes at the age she is that she is at a marriageable age. And a large part of being a woman in that time would have been getting married and having children and raising a family and, of course, having a dowry. And she isn't going to have a very large dowry because her family is very poor. And she doesn't know who she's going to marry. And she realizes that when she is married, her role will be to raise children and to be a wife. And she's not really sure if that's what she wants for her life. Because of all that entails, and she very much wants to be valued, and she's worried that if she gets married, she might not end up married to a person who values her, and that's something that she struggles with throughout the story. But the one thing that makes Shamira stand out is her passion and her boldness, because her family is a family of shepherds, and her grandfather has been a shepherd for many years, and he has always told her about one night when he was out shepherding his fields, when angels came to him and the other shepherds and told him that the Christ was here, the time of the Messiah was here, and when he had this opportunity to go find a babe wrapped in swaddling cloth and lying in a manger, just as the angel of the Lord had said to him. And he's told his children this story over and over again. And he's told his grandchildren this story over and over and over again, because he knows that it's true, and he's believed it his whole life. And he wants his grandchildren to go out and find the Messiah, because it is what he is going to save them all, essentially. And so Shamira, when things start to take a turn for the worse for her family, she immediately goes on this quest to find Christ and to ask him to help her family and to save her family. And it's really her journey of discovering that, she does have value, and Jesus does exist, and he is real, and she kind of goes along and she experiences the last few weeks of his ministry and his death and of course his resurrection. And I won't get into too much of that because of spoilers, but it is a very passionate story. It comes from the depths of my heart, and it explores a lot of themes like worth and value and love and forgiveness, and just knowing the power of your words, that your words have power. And it's not published yet. I'm still pursuing publication, but if you would like to pray for me, then I am always telling people the best way that you can pray for me is to pray for my story, that it gets out there and that it gets to a place where it needs to be, because I have felt ever since God put this story on my heart that it is meant for people in the world to read. So if you would like to pray for me, then pray for my story and for me as I am writing and editing and revising and submitting for publication.
What are your plans for the future, both as an author and personally?
For me, my author plans are a little bit top secret right now. I have been working very heavily on publishing my novel. I do have some new leads in terms of how I'm planning to publish my novel and what the official title will be, when I'm planning to actually release it. But all of these are very top secret plans right now because I'm still finalizing all of the details, and I don't want to share anything until I have all of the details finalized and I learn more. But I am in the phase where I am getting ready to publish my novel and to start my official author career. So that is a plan in the next few years, to have my book published, and possibly even several books in the series based on Shamira's family members and the early church published. But personally, my personal plans for 2020 are to get my book to a place where I am comfortable publishing it and sharing it with other people. And I'm also looking to graduate college here in 2020. I'll be graduating in fall with my BA in English, which is very exciting. And just, growing and seeing where this crazy adventure takes me. I started my blog and my YouTube and Instagram and all of that in 2018. 2017, 2018, and it's been a very interesting ride seeing how God has already used this journey to spread the love of biblical fiction, and then also just put so much into my life. I've met so many amazing people through this journey and through sharing biblical fiction, and I've met so many friends and like-minded people that I just want to keep doing what I'm doing and see where it takes me.
Is there anything else you'd like us to know about you?
Anything else I'd like you to know about me? Well, I'd love for you to know that I do host a quarterly biblical fiction book club. Every quarter we pick a new biblical fiction book to read, and we go through it, and we, at the end, have a little bit of a discussion about it and how it compared to the biblical accounts. And my goal there is to really blend Bible study with biblical fiction reading, and to read between the lines, as it were, and see how God can speak to us through the art of fiction. The tagline for the book club is studying God's word through the art of story, and that book club is called Biblical Fiction Buffs on Goodreads, so you can go to Goodreads and look it up if you're interested and join. And we're not just a book club, we're also a discussion group, so if you ever just want to geek out about biblical fiction in general or ask a question, there are discussion boards for that there as well. So participating in the book club is not necessarily your only option, but it is an option if you join our group on Goodreads. I'm also on Instagram. I do the whole bookstagramming thing, and I love sharing my favorite books there through pictures and sharing author updates and writing updates there. And my handles for everything are at Jenna Van Mourik. I'm at Jenna Van Mourik on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and Facebook, and Pinterest. So I'm active all over there. And I just love publishing and sharing on my blog as well, www.authorjennavanmourik.com, my love of biblical fiction and Bible study. I post weekly to YouTube and almost every single day on Instagram, and I post here and there on all the other platforms whenever I can. If you'd like to get specific author updates from me, then I strongly recommend signing up for my email list. You can sign up for my email list on my website at www.authorjennavanmourik.com. Go to that link and scroll down to the bottom, sign up for my newsletter, and I send out monthly updates about my books, what I'm writing, what I'm reading, and what I'm doing with my life. But that's a little bit about me, and I hope you enjoyed this video and getting to know me and my author journey and all of that through this whole interview. I really enjoyed these questions. I think they were great questions, so I want to thank Alan Stedham for having me on his channel to interview and talk about my life, my testimony, and biblical fiction and books, because obviously that is why I'm here, is to share my love of books and be a bookish person. So yeah, thank you so much for having me, and yeah, thank you for listening. If you made it this far, I really appreciate it, so thank you.
So how about that, folks? I want to thank Jenna Van Mourik for agreeing to do this interview today, and she has her own YouTube channel. I'll put the link in with the description, and thank you so much for watching this today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to my channel, click the little notification bell, and that way you'll get updates when new videos come out, and share the videos. We'll see you next time.